Hi, my name is Chris Parkhurst. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'm also the host of the Documentary Life podcast, a show that spans 140 episodes, has been downloaded in over 135 countries, and I've been producing for about 5 years. I decided to put each and every episode up here onto YouTube to sort of expand the audience, and as we say in the show, maybe inspire and inform some more doc filmmakers, hopefully like yourself. In the episodes, you may find some older, maybe outdated URLs, in particular any of the documentary filmmaking courses that we do offer online. If you have any questions about the URLs, simply look in the show notes on this page, here on this YouTube page, and that'll be able to take you where you need to go to. Other than that, I hope you enjoy the show, and it's great to have another listener to the Documentary Life. Have a great day. Microphone check, 1, 2. CC, hello and welcome. CC, hello and welcome.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
She sells seashells by the seashore. She sells seashells by the seashore. There we go, rolling.
Film doesn't change the world, people change the world. But film can be a powerful tool in organizing people, engaging people, and in getting people to feel something because you've told them a story that moves them emotionally, and now they have to come to terms with those feelings.
Hello and welcome to The Documentary Life, a show that sets out to inspire and inform you on how to best live and lead your own documentary life. I am your host, Chris G. Parkhurst, and this is episode number 44. And it is brought to you by Kartemquin Films, proud creators of documentary film, the Documentary Life podcast, and the Documentary Academy, our industry-changing A to Z documentary filmmaking program that will transform you into the documentary filmmaker that you've always wanted to be. Find out more at thedocumentarylife.com/academy. As many of you are already probably aware of, there was no show last week due to a work trip to Amsterdam. It was a whirlwind of a trip. In fact, I was out on a Sunday evening and back to the States early evening on Wednesday. Before that, I'd traveled back to Portland, Oregon to shoot 2 jobs. So yeah, pretty packed few weeks there. And admittedly, I did get a little behind on TDL. And so I decided it might be better to take the 2 days that I did have between trips and spend that time with family instead of rushing to, put something together for an episode. I made the right decision, but it definitely felt strange. It still feels strange that, last Friday went by where I didn't publish a new show. It was the first time since I began doing the show back in June of 2016, that I'd even ever, that I'd taken a week off. My time shooting in Portland and then this job in Amsterdam, it gave me a little time to reflect on these types of jobs, travel jobs, which, by the way, for the most part, huge fan of. For me, it's a time where I can just, put my head down and focus on nothing but the job, doing what I love and being away from home, doing all of this without the distractions of, the distractions that come along with being home, especially if you have a family. Anyhow, travel jobs like these, they're a great time for focus and reflection. And they're also a great time for honing your skills as a filmmaker, especially if you're doing a job where you are, perhaps one of the only people doing the job. Or if you're doing a documentary project and you're doing what I like to refer to as one-man banding it. That is to say, the project's a one-man crew. You are the crew. And I have a bunch of experience doing this sort of thing. Sometimes regrettably, but most of the time I've loved doing this kind of a job or shooting on a doc project in this fashion. But it's not easy. And if you're not smart about the choices you make before and during your production, you risk making something that looks like it was compromised by lack of funds or manpower or worse, expertise. But it definitely doesn't have to be this way. In fact, I bet that we've all seen more video than we realize that was fully created by one individual. There are, in fact, ways that we can all be doing the one-man band thing quite well, to the point where no one would ever know that we were the shooter and the sound person and the director, the editor, the producer, and whatever else. And when we come back from a short break, I'm going to give you some real applicable tips on how to best achieve results doing doc work completely on your own. Over the last few years, as we've met and connected with more and more doc lifers, we've been asked what the most comprehensive doc filmmaking course out there is. The truth is, we didn't believe there was one. There are plenty of videos and some courses that walk you through some technical aspects of filmmaking and workshops that cover some of the business aspects, but there was nothing that specifically took the doc filmmaker through the whole actual doc filmmaking journey, both creative and business, from A to Z. That is, until we created one. The Documentary Academy is the only all-in-one online documentary film production course that actually starts from the beginning of your film's journey, from story conception through pre-production and actual production to post-production and through to the promotions, marketing, and distribution of your film. The Academy will help you make your most successful documentary film by guiding you on the journey from conception to launch. But don't just take our word for it. Have a look for yourself by going to thedocumentarylife.com/academy and discover everything that the Academy has to offer, including a video that takes you inside the Academy for a look around. The Documentary Academy has already greatly helped others realize their power and potential as doc filmmakers. Why not be the next person who brings an awesome documentary film to life? Head on over to thedocumentarylife.com/academy today, and we'll see you there. As documentary filmmakers, we all froth at the mouth at the prospect of doing our projects with some kind of real budget and crew. I mean, by nature, I think as doc filmmakers, we're often working short-handed with little resources, or I should say little to no resources. And that the idea of having an actual crew and maybe some ample funding, it's something that we're always dreaming about, or at least striving to achieve. But what if instead of focusing on what we didn't have, we instead put our thoughts and energies into best using what it is that we do have? What if we made the absolute most of every single piece of gear, every resource at our disposal, and instead of seeing a particular challenge or pitfall as a potential game ender, the creative solution that we come up with, that ends up being a game changer for our film? I remember years ago reading an article about the filmmaker Steven Soderbergh. It was in some filmmaking magazine. It was probably after another one of his Hollywood heist films, Ocean's 66 or something. I don't know at that point. I sound like I'm disparaging his work there, but I should say I actually greatly admire Soderbergh as a filmmaker. On one hand, he creates some of the more successful Hollywood films, such as the Ocean's whatever franchise or Traffic or Aaron Brockovich. And then on the other hand, he'll go off and self-fund his own experiments and creativity with films like Bubble or Schizopolis or Solaris. And for the record, I am a massive fan of his adaptation of Solaris. The original film adaptation by Tarkovsky, it's still probably one of my favorite sci-fi films of all time. But Soderbergh's, it also gives me chills. They're totally different approaches to the novel. And for me, they both are mesmerizing pieces of work. I could do a whole show about Solaris. I know it's not a doc subject, but can we do that? Pretty please? Okay, maybe I'll just have to start a podcast that's devoted to Solaris or fans of Solaris. Or maybe I'll figure out some kind of documentary. Anyhow, Soderbergh. I was reading this article, and he spends a chunk talking about how he misses the old days of when he didn't always have the resources, to shoot a scene a certain way, or cast a particular actor, or get, the crane shot that he's hoping for. Nowadays, he had felt that he constantly purposefully had to challenge himself as a filmmaker, because too often, whenever he encountered any sort of issue on set or potentially on an upcoming shoot day, no sooner had he described the issue than producers were already working on fixing the problem. And by fixing it, I do mean finding the money to simply buy whatever they needed to achieve Soderbergh's vision. Soderbergh was maintaining that once you'd achieved a certain degree of success within the film industry, there was really no turning back. Resources and funding were now simply there for you. You were, in essence, kind of stripped to really come up with a creative solution to a problem. And as we all know, sometimes the lovely accidents, right? The lovely accidents are the creative solutions that really make a film stand out. Those are what often make films completely fresh and exhilarating. Now, sure, we'd all love to have this kind of a problem, and I'm sure that Soderbergh was probably romanticizing the starving artist a little bit. But I never forgot reading that, and I think there's an important point in there, which is to say that we should all maybe embrace a little bit more, right? Embrace what not having an infinite amount of resources actually does allow for us. which is, true art, maybe true artistic creativity and ingenuity, or the freedom of not being beholden to the influences of funding sources. It's obviously not really a problem for most of us doc filmmakers, but nonetheless, I think it's something worthy of keeping in mind. And certainly for the purposes of what we're talking about here, how to best be a one-person crew for your project or your gig or your job. I'm saying one person here. I'm sure I said one man earlier. Please consider these one and the same. I'm using them interchangeably, and I'm using them devoid of gender. I hope it's obvious that I mean men and women. We're all adults here, right? I know you probably get that, and I can't believe I had to say that, but there it is. I promise not to say it again. Okay, so let's take a look at the equipment needs of the one-person crew. You're going to need a camera. You're going to need to record sound. You might need some kind of light source, but often we're trying to take advantage of daylight as much as we can, or other sources in interiors. And you'll most likely need some way to offload and store footage. Those are probably the most basic needs that you'll have, other than food and water. And let's assume for this segment that there will be two kinds of you out there operating as one-person crews. There will be those of you working in more controlled environments, right? More ideal settings. And then there will be some of you working in less than ideal environments, say out in the mountains or on an island somewhere. In both cases, you'll need a proper way to be carrying your gear. And that's a big thing, right? The footprint on the setting you're operating in, as well as, the overall maneuverability in which you're working. If you're shooting out in developing world terrain or a conflict zone or say the mountains of Nepal, which I obviously did with Journey to Kathmandu, you'll need to travel light and efficiently. Think minimalist here, people, not only with the amount of gear, but with where and how you'll be packing your gear. Thankfully, there are so many options available now, especially with the plethora of available video gear that's out there nowadays. There's a company out of Israel called Kata, and they make Kata bags. I've used them with great success in the past. Their bags were the first ones that just happened to catch my eye, because not only were they rugged but lightweight, but they also had a lot of removable storage compartments. And that's the case with many travel bags. I do understand that now. And that's probably something you'll want. Not all cameras and lenses are created the same, right? Many different shapes and sizes and weights. So removable or flexible compartments are really attractive here. Some of the best ones that I've seen are compartments that are simply removed and reattached by Velcro, basically. I was able to keep my camera, a couple of lenses, batteries, a shotgun mic and lavaliers, and tapes. Yes, I did say tapes, since when I shot J2K, I was using mini HD tapes. I was able to keep them all in my Kata bag. The only thing I didn't really have in my Kata bag was my set of sticks, which one of my porters carried around attached alongside the Kata bag. If you're doing some dock work and perhaps shooting a smaller job in a more controlled environment, say an office building or someone's house, you will have the luxury of traveling with items that you can simply set aside. And this means you won't have to stuff everything that you're working with into a bag. You'll probably be able to go around with a few different bags, some stands, extension cords, etc., etc. You obviously won't be able to efficiently haul all of these around at one time. So if you're making, for instance, a number of moves during the day, I'd highly recommend getting yourself maybe some kind of camera cart. There are a number of different options, again, that are out there, but it's really not necessary to break the bank here. That would be easy to do. Magliners, which are great collapsible camera carts and do tend to be industry standards, they can be pretty expensive. They start at $300 and go quickly up from there, depending on added options. I actually came across a really great DIY option by a Steadicam operator by the name of Lee Clements. He basically goes through how to use Amazon and or Home Depot to build a great, easy-to-use, collapsible and sturdy version that nicely fits in the boot of your car. In fact, I'll put the link to that article up in the show notes for this episode. Anyhow, a camera cart will save you loads of time, trips to the car, and maybe some muscle aches in the morning. Though that's, of course, there's something to be said about muscle aches, right? That's actually a good feeling the next morning. One of the elements to filmmaking that can surprisingly easily be overlooked is the audio element. And I've certainly talked about this and preached this on the show here a number of times. It's easy to become so focused and you'll pardon that pun, on the camera work that the risk of audio being compromised, it's pretty understandable. There is a reason that camera operators shoot the visuals and sound people record the audio. Sometimes on those minuscule budgets, the shooter is asked to monitor the audio, and that does not generally make a shooter very happy. It's a big responsibility, and it is easy to mess up. You'd be surprised, right? It's easy to mess up. Again, I've said before here on the program that the sound people are some of the most underappreciated people in the industry. It only takes one time to wish you'd had a sound person on your crew. But for the one-person crew, we are obviously the sound person. So let's stick with that now, and how we can best achieve good audio while we're also shooting and directing and conducting interviews and doing sound. First and foremost, always bring your headset or a pair of earbuds. Earbuds make more sense, especially if you're talking with your subject. You can have one ear monitoring audio and the other listening to the person you're talking with. However you do it, you have to be monitoring your audio at all times. Don't simply rely. The worst thing you can do is simply rely on your audio meters. Believe me, I've made that needless mistake more times than I'd care to admit. And you'll be kicking yourself when you get home, safe in the knowledge that you properly monitored your audio meters, and then you realize that there's this low frequency hum or intermittent interference with the wireless lav, that no amount of reading meters off of the camera would have ever caught. If all else fails, trust what you can hear. I would rather my on-camera meters malfunction than I would the capacity to monitor the output with a pair of headphones. I will trust what I can hear way more than I can see any day. Most cameras enable you to record 2 tracks of audio, and generally you'll use one track for a lav mic and then the other for the shotgun mic. And this is great to always have 2 options for your audio. However, if you're ever in an instance where it only makes sense to use one audio source, either the lav or the shotgun, if your camera allows for it, split those signals to tracks so that you can adjust levels separately. And in this case, make sure to do that second track. Make sure that the second track, I should say, is always lower in modulation than the first. That way, if you're ever over-modulating on the first track, that you always have a backup with that second track of audio, which you had recorded, hopefully at a lower level. One more quick note that I'll add about audio before moving on from that has to do with lavaliers or lapel mics, as they're also known. I realize the temptation is to always go wireless. They're quick to set up. They're easy to maneuver around with, certainly if you're following someone around with a camera. But if you're ever in a sit-down interview setting, if you are able to, using a wired lavalier might be a better way to go. There's nothing worse than having to get up in the middle of an interview to attend to audio issues. And as I'm sure you've encountered yourself, some kind of interference with a wireless signal, it is not an uncommon problem, unfortunately. If you go wired straight to the camera, you will not have to worry about any kind of interference. If I'm doing the one-man band thing, I will always try and use my wired lav if I can. One of the frustrating parts when shooting something solo is that you only have one camera angle to choose from. I should say you often only have one camera angle to choose from. This has obvious limiting factors later on in post-production in the editing room. Now one camera is how the majority of us stock filmmakers shoot anyhow, right? But there is in fact a way to shoot, say, an interview in a way that will allow for you to have 2 focal lengths to choose from when you're editing. And that's without having to set up another camera. One of the ways that I like to shoot, in particular interviews, when I'm going solo on a shoot, is to shoot in 4K. By shooting 4K and plopping this footage into a 1080 timeline in your edit, or more accurately, a 1920 by 1080 timeline, it gives you all kinds of room in which to make pans and zooms within your image without losing any kind of resolution. Remember, shooting 4K is 3840 by 2160. So when you put that into a 1920 by 1080 timeline, you're giving yourself ample room to make any necessary adjustments, like, say, zooming into a tighter shot. If done properly, it will appear as if you've actually had a second camera, only with a longer, say focal length. Now, I'm most likely telling you something you already know. Totally get that. I realize this. But what you may not have realized is that you can do this even if you don't have a camera equipped with 4K functionality. See, most anything you shoot for the web is going to be presented at 1280 by 720. This is still HD video, it's just not full res HD video, which again is the 1920 by 1080. So if you're doing a project or a job where the final output is absolutely intended for a web audience, that means you can output your final movie to that 1280 by 720. Well, guess what happens when you shoot full res HD in 1920 by 1080 and drop this into a 720 timeline? Yep. The same thing as I mentioned earlier. You will now have enough room to make zooms and tilts, without losing resolution, and give yourself a second camera angle. Again, it's the same principle as I talked about earlier with the 4K and 1920 example. I think that it's just used less often because people tend to forget that if your final output is for web, it's generally not necessary to be editing in a full res 1920 by 1080 timeline. Honestly, I do this for 99% of anything that I shoot for the web. Now, of course, if you're doing a documentary film project, I would not recommend doing this. You want as much resolution as possible at all times. You might get away with shooting 4K and editing in a 1080 timeline, but don't shoot something that is your documentary film in 1080 with the intent of editing in a 720 timeline. That's a terrible idea. Any shooter will tell you that. Any DP will tell you that. But if you're shooting for the web, by all means, I don't see any reason not to take advantage of the added resolution. Something else that might seem a little obvious, but I'm going to expound upon it regardless, is the idea of becoming very familiar with all of your gear. Not just your camera, not just your sound, or your offloading footage workflow, but all of your gear and all of your workflow. Because as the one-person crew, the last thing you ever want on a shoot is any sort of issue or downtime. You need all of your gear to be working seamlessly. And more than that, you need to be working seamlessly with your gear. When you're on the move and you're shooting, there isn't time to be looking at your camera to find the aperture dial or the white balance toggle or the audio meters adjustment. When you have a thought to make some sort of an adjustment, you want to be able to instinctively go to the place, where you make that adjustment without having to think about it or certainly look at it. If I had to look down at my camera buttons while I was walking and shooting in temples in Cambodia or mountains in Nepal, it would have been very disruptive to the workflow. And that's exactly what you don't want. The more you can stay in the flow when you're shooting, obviously, the better. And the same goes for when you're shooting interviews. You don't want to have to look down at your camera when you're trying to conduct a conversation with an interviewee. That then risks becoming disruptive to the interview process as well. And actually, along those lines, when conducting an interviews as the one-person crew, it's best to have your topics of your interview sort of embedded in your brain so that you're not looking down and fumbling at a sheet of questions. Remember, a one-person crew still only has two hands. We may be wearing 10 different hats, but we still only have our two hands. So if you're holding a sheet of questions, well, that probably takes away the ability to easily make an audio or camera adjustment. You'll have to stop the interview, place the sheet of paper down on the floor, then make your technical adjustment, pick the sheet of paper back up, and then begin the interview again. Awkward. Try and have as much of your topics of conversation in your head as possible. If you're in a pinch, you can always tape an index card with some short, topic headings to your camera or above your monitor. This will at least keep your hands free. I can easily go on and on about best practices for shooting with the one-person crew approach. I could probably do multiple episodes about this, but I do need to wrap up this segment. But before I do that, I want to say one more thing. And it's about power. Even if you've already scouted a location and you're in some super cush setting, don't ever assume that you'll have AC power. You never know when there could be a power outage, for instance. So always be prepared to go to battery power. And certainly if you're in settings like I often am when shooting in developing countries, battery power is probably the only power. So you've got to be super smart about the number of bats that you bring with you, as well as the way in which you use that battery power throughout the day. When I was in the mountains in Nepal, right up by the border with Tibet in a place called Rashwa, there was very little power. It was intermittent at best, and it was hydropower from a dam upstream. I was anticipating these kinds of scenarios, so I made sure to bring loads of batteries with me, and I made sure that all of them were charged before leaving Kathmandu to venture out into the mountains. And then once there, I quickly figured out what hours the town might have power, and then I'd be sure to plug a double charger into an outlet. I had brought a double charger with me because, in essence, it enabled me to not have to change batteries out as often, as I would have if I'd only had a single charger. As an aside, I'll tell you that the guest house where I was staying up in Rashwa, eventually a few days into filming, they were completely clued into what I was doing. So often I could even leave my charger unattended, and the proprietor's wife would sometimes, she'd change out freshly charged batteries with the used ones, that I had laying beside the charger. Now picture a 70-year-old woman who doesn't speak a lick of English. She's dressed in traditional garb. She doesn't know anything about cameras, and she's swapping out batteries for, some 30-something dude who doesn't speak a lick of Tibetan or Nepalese, maybe knows a little bit about cameras. Just hold that image in your mind for a second. It's a great image, right? That, my friends, that is half the reason I shoot in those kinds of settings. Look, it's never easy being a one-person crew, but there are things that you can be doing to best maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of your shoot. I find the one-person crew thing, when done right, it can be an exciting and extremely gratifying practice. There are just a few things that you want to be aware of is all, but when done correctly, this can end up being some of the work that you are the most proud of. And now it's time for the Doc Lifer Community Question of the Week. This one comes from longtime listener, Doc Lifer, and amazing photographer Richard Simcoe. I've been following some of Richard's work via his Twitter and Instagram accounts for about a year now, and we've emailed a bit as well. And judging by the work that I've seen so far, I do believe that Richard and I, we're maybe kindred spirits. And after hearing the email that I'm about to read to you and seeing some of his work yourself, you might feel the same way. Richard writes, "Hi Chris, I am writing you as a reaction to the latest episode of Documentary Life podcast. You expressed interest in what your audience is up to and who we actually are. I believe I already mentioned this one before, but in case I hadn't, I'm currently working as a lighting artist in VFX, an animation industry. I am in the film industry, so to speak, however I am not working on documentaries. My interest in documentary genre comes partially from photojournalism and documentary photography, and partially it is as a result of influence from my dad. He used to watch lots of documentaries, and I did too. If I look at the whole thing from another angle, I feel I am a bit disappointed and disillusioned by where the feature film industry is going. I love what I am doing for work, but I am not excited about movies themselves. It feels like a money-making manufacture. There is no drive to produce an original movie with good story and good acting. It is all money-driven. Movies are released and usually forgotten before the DVD version comes out. Personally, I would love to be a part of something more meaningful than that. These are the reasons and influences that are shaping my interest in documentaries. I also want to touch upon something you mentioned in the podcast, and I believe it was from some of your listeners. It was about a guy who was good at photography, but he didn't want to make it a living for fear of getting disconnected from his passion. I can somehow relate to that. Take my career, for example. I really liked CG and VFX if it was done well, and I worked to support the story and was not in the eye. That was the reason I got into the industry. Things have changed, however, and VFX seemed to become the main selling point itself. Seems that story and acting and everything that makes the movie good and compelling was pushed back. At that point, you start to ask questions about your career choices. Even if you look at the documentaries as a genre, there are so many branches within that same tree to choose from. I absolutely love documentaries about nature, various cultures, disappearing tribes, etc. I might not be so excited in some other subgenres or stories. I think that's natural. So I'd rather do it as a hobby and pick what I want to do rather than do anything just for the sake of making a documentary. And this ties well into another thing I wanted to mention. For somebody like myself, documentary filmmaking as a hobby, it may be interesting to have discussion about mini or micro-budget documentaries, run-and-gun style shooting, one-man crew, etc. It's just a suggestion. Anyway, really appreciate the podcast. I really enjoy every episode. Richard. Well, Richard, thank you for taking the time, man, to share with me your thoughts on the podcast and your own interest in documentaries, and then some of your recommendations. I hope that you enjoyed today's initial segment, actually. That was absolutely a direct response to your request. So I do certainly hope that it was what you were looking for, and I think it's a great suggestion. I think a lot of people will benefit from that. You know, I feel the same way that you do about the state of feature films. I will rarely watch a feature narrative film these days. And while I obviously am watching more docs these days due to, the podcast, my viewing habits have been trending to docs for probably a decade now anyhow. I used to be a massive feature film guy, and I thought that I wanted to direct narrative features. I was heavily into directors like Tarkovsky, Von Trier, Adam Mikoyan, Kurosawa. I got way into the Dogma 95 movement. I couldn't get enough of those damn Swedes and Danes, who were pushing the envelope and really making some great cinema at the time. American cinema in the late 60s and early 70s is some of the best stuff out there. French New Wave with Godard and Truffaut. All of that stuff absolutely fascinated me for years and years, and it shaped a lot of what I like in my cinema today. I just tend to look now for its incarnation in documentary. I don't know. I think I got burnt, and I think I got really jaded with the film industry myself, Richard. Not unlike yourself, the features and TV shows that I ever worked on, they actually really kind of made me not like movies, and certainly not TV, or how movies got made. And it made me really start to lose hope in cinema. As you had said, as you had alluded to, I believe that everything seemed completely driven by dollars and cents, and in ways that aren't necessarily so obvious to the average moviegoer. But there's a reason there are so many remakes, so many franchises, so many reboots. Oh, if I have to hear that word again. There's no cause or need for Hollywood to take any risks anymore. They control the cinemas. They control what you see. They control the advertising to alert you of the movies that are available. The music that gets played in a film is most likely tied to the record company who is tied to the film company. The actors that are attached to films are rarely the best people suited for a part, but studies have shown that just about anyone will now go see any film starring Ryan Gosling or Jennifer Lawrence, or that at least half of the population will go and see the next installment of the Fast and Furious franchise if you tell them that it's good to do so. I could go on, but I will save you from my own sort of existential crises about the film industry and film in general. But documentaries always seem to offer up something different for me. There was something much more pure about the documentary filmmaking experience, I think. I really dug the idea of leaving my day job, behind me, for the most part commercial, by the way. I sometimes have more respect for the commercial industry than I do the feature film biz, because at least commercials are being upfront about their intent to sell something to you. But anyway, I like the idea of film, TV, commercial industry being the way that I paid the bills, and the documentary work being something that I did for myself because it was something that I still could love and believe in. I think that you can relate to this, Richard, with your VFX work. It seems like you are making a very conscious decision to keep the documentary and the work that you do on features, to keep them quite separate. And I think that I can understand this inclination to do so. I can't say it's entirely, how I do it. I do sometimes work on other people's doc projects for pay. So documentary isn't entirely separate from my paid work. And I do intend to try and make money on my future documentary films. But for the most part, I still work the commercial and corporate video gigs as paid gigs while I do my docs. And like you, my tastes for cinema have clearly been affected by having worked in the industry. And I am almost exclusively drawn to documentary storytelling nowadays. Though, honestly, I'd still pay just about any amount of money to go see a Tarkovsky or Kurosawa retrospective up on the big screen. They were absolute masters of cinema, and their films were unquestionably meant for the big screen only. Now, what about the rest of you doc lifers? I'll bet a number of you could relate similar feelings to this subject. And we certainly all have our own reasons for doing documentary films. We all have the various roads that have brought us to documentary. In fact, I'd love to hear more of this kind of thing from you guys. So as Richard's done here, please share your journey to documentary with me. Or if you'd like to send me some feedback or offer a topic suggestion or a doc industry guest suggestion or have a question you might like me to answer, please email me at chris@barongfilms.com. I'd love to hear your comments, suggestions, or questions, or again, your journey to documentary filmmaking. I'd love to have that be a part of the next Doc Lifer Community Question of the Week. And speaking of legends of filmmaking, when we come back, I have the distinct pleasure of bringing to you a conversation that I recently had with Gordon Quinn, co-founder of Kartemquin Films, and director, producer, and executive producer of over 50 documentary films, including the game-changing Oscar-nominated Hoop Dreams. It's a conversation with a true giant in American documentary, and I can't wait to share it with you. I am your host, Chris G. Parkhurst. And this is The Documentary Life. Gordon Quinn, welcome to the program. It's exciting to have you here with us today on The Documentary Life.
Glad to be here.
It's funny, your name was actually brought to my attention a couple of months ago from a TDL listener, a fellow doc filmmaker, and actually a sound professional in the Chicago area, where I believe you are currently based out of. And his name is Corey Koken. And, and right, Corey had emailed me. He'd responded to kind of a call that I had made on the air, if you will, basically asking listeners to reach out to me and, open up that dialogue between listeners to tell me what it is that they need. What's the information that they crave? I asked them to offer up topic conversation and other topic suggestions, as well as if they had any guest suggestions as well. And he wrote me a really thoughtful email that if I might, I'd love to share it with you. And I'll go ahead and read that. And Corey had this to say. You asked for people you should talk to, and my recommendation would be for Gordon Quinn. I have known him since I was a child and have worked with him on many of his films. He has created more docs than most of us have ever seen. On top of being an amazing filmmaker, he is quite the hero to me and super nice. When and if you reach out to him, make sure to drop my name if it helps. And I then quickly looked you up. I have to say, I'm embarrassed to admit that I didn't know the name recognition immediately. But of course, as soon as I looked up your name, via Google, and suddenly Kartemquin came up, and then all of the films that you've been associated with, I could immediately understand why Corey had reached out to me and said that you would be a great person to have on the program. And so, again, I thank you so much for joining me today.
Sure. Well, I knew Corey's dad. And that's why he met me as a little kid, because his dad, used to mix a lot of our films back in the day. And just recently, we kind of reconnected. I reconnected with Corey.
Okay.
And he mixed our 63 boycott film, which is about the great school boycott in 1963, where the African-American kids walked out of school because they were putting trailers behind the black schools so they wouldn't have to move those kids into the adjacent underutilized white schools. But Corey just mixed that film, which I shot over 50 years ago, back when I was a student at the University of Chicago.
Wow.
We just finished it, and it's going to be premiering at the Chicago Film Festival.
Gordon, before we get further into an examination of some of the specific films, I do feel like it's important that I read one more thing, and this comes from, and this is to give contextual sort of information to my listeners. And this comes from the Kartemquin site, and this was from, I believe, a press release when you were awarded a Career Achievement Award from IDA, International Documentary
Oh,
Association.
Yeah, that was a great event.
And if I could read this one paragraph, this kind of sums up a lot of sort of really what Corey, our fellow listener, was referring to earlier. And it says, Gordon Quinn has produced, directed, and or been cinematographer on over 55 films across 5 decades, garnering many awards, including 3 Emmys, 2 Peabodys, the IDA Award for Best Limited Series, the DGA Award for Directing, and an Oscar nomination and the Robert F. Kennedy Award for Hoop Dreams. His recent films as executive producer include The Interrupters, The Trials of Muhammad Ali, Life Itself, The Home Stretch, On Beauty, Almost There, Saving Messinak, and we actually had Brett E. Huffman on the show here earlier this year, by the way, In the Game, and the 6-part series Hard Earned. A longtime activist for public and community media, Quinn was integral to the creation of ITVS, public access television in Chicago, and the documentary filmmakers' Statement of Best Practice and Fair Use, and in forming the Indie Caucus to support diverse independent voices on public television. Over 50 years at Kartemquin, Quinn has inspired and guided an immeasurable number of media makers whose films have left a lasting impact on millions of viewers. And that is the impact of the work that you have done for years and years, Mr. Quinn. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about Kartemquin Films. Why don't you first give us an explanation, if you could, Gordon? Give us an explanation of what Kartemquin is and why you started Kartemquin in the first place.
Well, we started in the beginning. You know, we were 3 guys in college, and we were very influenced by the early verite films. I think a seminal moment for me is when I saw Ricky Leacock and Joyce Chopra's film, Happy Mother's Day, the work of the Maysles brothers, Frederick Wiseman, and Jean Rouch also was very important for us, Chronicle of the Summer.
Okay.
We were seeing these films that were, you know, recording reality as it unfolded before the camera and shaping stories more like a drama would be, out of what happens between people and, you know, just observing behavior and that kind of thing. And so that kind of interest stimulated us to want to start and make films like that, you know. And I went off and worked in the industry. When I went to the University of Chicago, they really didn't have filmmaking there. There was Doc Films, the film club, and I joined that immediately. And and actually they were into the auteur theory. You know, they were showing, Howard Hawks films and stuff like that, which I loved, but it wasn't what I wanted. You know, I wanted to do documentary. I already knew that. And so I went off and worked in the industry for a couple of years. I wound up in New York working on the film festival that Murray Lerner directed, and I was working with Howard Alk, who I learned to edit from. And I worked here in Chicago for Mike Shea, an old ebony and life photographer who was getting into film, and I really learned camera work from him. And then I came back. We got this opportunity to make our first film, Home for Life, in an old age home.
Right.
And so that was that early period of Kartemquin where we were trying to, you know, make verite films that reflected society's problems and social issues back on society itself. But it was the 60s. And we very quickly, people started to come around to our little film company and want to be associated with us. And we were all becoming politicized around civil rights, around the war in Vietnam, and began to see that you had to do more than just reflect society back on itself. You had to really deal with power relationships between groups and between people. And so if you look at our films, as people came around, we kind of evolved into what we called the collective. And that was kind of that late 60s and, you know, through the 70s period of Kartemquin, where, you know, half the people in the group were union organizers and teachers and came from other fields. And the other half of the people were people who did have some kind of filmmaking background. and our films became very political. They still had a verite base. Almost all of our films had we had characters and we were following people, but there would be a lot more analysis and in some cases driving narration, driving these early films, the Chicago Maternity Center story, Last Pullman Car, films like that. Um, and the name, really, the three of us who founded the thing, within the first couple of years, Carter and Temner, had left the organization for various reasons, usually because they needed to make a living. And we weren't really making any money. But, the name was the three of our names put together. We thought it sounded like Potemkin, a really
the
lame
Battleship
idea.
Potemkin. That's great.
Yeah, the famous Russian film. And, if we had it to do over again, I think we'd think of something a little less, we get mail addressed to Kartemquin, and it's been a difficult name over the years.
That's great. Well, you've mentioned politicized and political a number of times, and obviously there's activism involved in certainly some of your earlier work at that time, even prior to filmmaking. What does it mean today? What does it mean today to be a part of the Kartemquin team and the catalog, really?
Well, I think we always think, I wrote my BA paper at the University of Chicago on cinema verite and democracy, and was heavily influenced by the thinking of John Dewey, the American philosopher. And I think right from the beginning, one of our core ideas was that documentary had a critical role to play in the democratic process. The kind of in-depth storytelling that it is, the ability to engage people on an emotional level and make them feel things, have them respond to characters that they might not, people that they might not come into contact with who are different from them or from different parts of the country or different economic classes and different races. That had tremendous potential for playing a role within the democratic process. So we believe that at the beginning, and I think that's one of our core beliefs today. Everything's digital and we work in different ways. And recently we've done a couple of series of very short films that were only released on the web. But all of it, in some way, we're looking at documentary filmmaking as making a contribution to the democratic process and to kind of people and forces within our society coming together with powerful human stories where you see the consequences of decisions that we make as a society and we make as a democracy. We see those consequences of those decisions playing out in people's lives.
Well, I'd like to maybe even dig a little bit deeper, and to be honest, I was saving this towards the latter part of the interview, but it seems like you've really just given me a great segue there, Gordon. I know that as a young, perhaps, if I may, ideological filmmaker, certainly in the early days of Kartemquin, it seemed your intent on documentary film was as a vehicle for maybe some social change or real social change. And
sure.
And so I would love to ask you, do you still deep down hold fast to this belief? I mean, can documentary film do more than even create awareness? Can it create true change?
Well, again, I think those core beliefs are still there. How you actually do that can be very different. So, in those early years, we evolved from our very early films, Home for Life and Thumbs Down and those films, which really just told a story about something that was going on and reflected what was going on in the world back into the society. And we thought that would be enough to make change.
Right.
As we started to understand more about power relationships, we'd start a film about a struggle to save a home delivery service for babies, or the struggle to keep the last plant that produced rail cars in the U.S. open. And we would see in these struggles that the people were going to lose. And so we felt a responsibility to try to put a more analytical frame around that story of these people struggling so you could really understand what they were up against and the history of the social forces that they were up against. But, you know, with a film like Hoop Dreams, which Steve James directed and did, and the producers were Steve James, Fred Marks, and Peter Gilbert, and they did this incredibly verite-driven human story about these young inner city boys and their dreams of making it to the NBA. And that film reached a huge audience. A lot of people watched that film that would never watch a film about a social problem or quote inner city family. You know, they're not going to watch a film about people who are different than them, but they watched Hoop Dreams, and all the social issues are embedded in the story that we tell in these people's lives. So that film, in many ways, brought us back to our roots of taking this more verite approach. But I think underneath it all, we've always believed that film doesn't change the world, people change the world, but film can be a powerful tool in organizing people, engaging people, and in getting people to feel something because you've told them a story that moves them emotionally. And now, you know, they have to come to terms with those feelings. I sometimes tell the story about we did one of the greatest things we ever did was a 7-hour television series for PBS called The New Americans.
Right.
And we did it at a point where there was a lot of debate, as there is today, about immigration. Immigration was becoming a hot issue. And we felt like, well, all these people are arguing about this issue, but they don't actually know anything about the actual people who they're arguing about, the actual families,
how
the
often
human
is that
stories
the case? Right.
of the immigrants. So we told a series of stories and wove the stories together in this terrific 7-hour series called The New Americans. And this was in the days where, you know, the internet, the World Wide Web was just up there. And there were these early, I forgot what they call them, but they were interactive. You know, you could leave a message and then someone could comment on your message, and, you know, kind of like Facebook, but before Facebook. You know,
like message boards type thing.
Yeah, like a message board.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was like. And so we had one for the New Americans. And there was a certain kind of comment that kept coming up, you know, after the broadcast, after the national broadcast. And it was someone saying, you know, I see what you people are up to. You've got an agenda, you know. You want me to see that these immigrants are, you know, they care about their families and they have dreams for their futures, and, you know, that they're kind of like me in some kind of way. And, you know, and you sort of did make me feel that, and I resent it. Oh. And my response was, great, I'll take that. That's the first step. I made somebody, the series got somebody to shift their perspective a little bit, to you know, have a moment of empathy that maybe they even felt resentful about, but had to come to terms with. And so I think that's the power of documentary film.
But Gordon, how does that, okay, help me understand how you as a filmmaker, how is that truly satisfying enough? Like, how is that satisfying enough when you know in your heart of hearts what you want is change, isn't it? Isn't that what we want, to create some kind of positive change? But to just say someone's thoughts shifted a little, or to the point that they resent you, isn't that just like, I don't know, just angering someone to get an emotion enough from them?
Well, but it's you know, it's what I'm focusing on is I made them feel something.
Yeah.
And no, it's not going to change them overnight. And a lot of films we do are films that are helping people in organizing context, films that people use to better understand a situation so they can come up with better organizing strategies. And when someone that we have been able to move them in that way, then maybe encounters a politician or an organizer or somebody who's doing voter registration, going door to door for a candidate or something, they're a little bit more open to hear something else. So I think it's all of these, it's not any one thing, but I think all of these things play a role.
Kind of collectively?
Yeah.
When I get an NBA, First thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go see my mama. I'm gonna buy a house. I'm gonna go there and make sure my sister and my brother's okay. If we okay or not. Probably get my dad Cadillac Oldsmobile so he can cruise in the game. Real long.
That was neat.
He dreams about it. You look at those basketball commercials where they be advertising like these Nike shoes, and he'll tell his little small brother, Joe, that's me.
The film Hoop Dreams in 1994, it's a film that seemed to shift. It really shifted some things for documentary. For one, it became the highest grossing doc at that time. For myself personally, Gordon, it was the first doc I had ever seen in a theater setting. And that radically changed my views on what documentary film even was and what that type of storytelling could be. I loved the intimacy with the subjects. I loved, the cinema verite aspect. And to be honest, it gave me hope and inspiration as a young filmmaker myself. And you could even argue in some ways that kind of filmmaking may have been even a little bit of a precursor for you'll forgive me, for reality TV. It certainly, I think, opened the doors for people on an audience level in terms of acceptance of documentary films. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it was an incredibly important film that really helped to make people understand what documentaries could be and the kind of audiences that they could reach. All of that is important. I hope it's not responsible for reality TV, which I think is really, a very different kind of thing, because reality TV is often contrived situations.
Oh, you bet.
And even when they're in the real world, they, a show like Cops or something, they're kind of done to a formula. And what was so important about Hoop Dreams, and I think it's true of many documentaries today, is that we didn't know where the story was going to go when we started it. We were just following it wherever it went. Mm. And during the 4.5 years that we were following the young men, it was extremely difficult to raise money for it. Nobody seemed to quite understand what we were doing until finally we got involved with KTCA in Minneapolis. And then near the end, the MacArthur Foundation came in and really gave us the money to finish the film and spend a couple years editing it, which we did.
You were an executive producer on this film, correct?
Correct.
As an executive producer on a documentary film, of course, a lot of my background happens to be in commercial and feature film work, and the documentary has really been the passion work, and that's what I'm doing more and more of these days. Right, the documentary is always that's the passion work, but that's always the goal. It's the commercial that allows me to do this work, and the executive producer plays a very particular role in say feature films. Help my audience understand, in particular, maybe in your instance on this film in Hoop Dreams, what are you doing as the executive producer on a documentary like this?
At Kartemquin, early on, really Hoop Dreams was the first time that I'd ever been an executive producer. The idea at Kartemquin is that I'm getting involved with the film creatively to really help the filmmakers make the film that is their vision. And I'm going to help with all aspects, including raising the money. In a feature film, an executive producer usually means in some kind of way that you played a critical role in putting the financing together.
Right.
But in our context, it means that I'm spending a lot of time with people in the editing room. There's even a couple tiny, I did very little shooting on Hoop Dreams, but I even did I shot a couple little scenes on the film. I'm consulting with the filmmakers about their relationship to their subjects and about problems that come up in the course of the filmmaking and that kind of thing. So it's a pretty hands-on kind of role.
Right.
I think, Peter Gilbert actually told me sort of after the film came out, he said, well, you really shouldn't be an executive producer. That just means you're connected to the money or something. And I didn't know, what title I should have. I think I have a title on there now that says creative consultant, or I can't remember what it says, but, a title that shows sort of more accurately my involvement in the film. But in the films that we do now, where I'm an executive producer, it's that same kind of thing. I'm working with the filmmakers, trying to make decisions about their, how they're going to relate to their subjects, dealing with ethical problems that come up in the course of shooting, looking at the footage as they go along and giving them feedback. And then really the big part of it is getting involved with them in the editing room.
Right. Okay. In many ways, Gordon, you're sort of this dream mentor figure that I imagine a lot of young documentary filmmakers are looking for. And so when a Steve James comes to you with a project like Hoop Dreams, or in the instance of Brent E. Huffman, who we've had here on the program, and his film was Saving Masainaka, I believe you were executive producer on that.
Right.
How do these guys approach you? Are they approaching you personally? Are they approaching you because of Kartemquin, or are they approaching you because of Gordon Quinn? How does that work, and how would somebody in the future approach you with their project?
It's changed over time. I mean, when the guys with Hoop Dreams, they were right out of film school, and they had an idea for a film, and they had encountered my producing partner, Jerry Blumenthal. They were in Southern Illinois, down in Carbondale, and so at the Big Muddy Film Festival, they encountered him, and they came to Kartemquin, to talk to us about this idea, which struck me as a really good idea, and we took the project on. And that was probably the beginning of what is our, the collective by that time had fallen apart, but we now have re-evolved and we keep reconfiguring ourselves over the years. And now we're a true media arts organization that works with younger filmmakers, that has programs. We have our Diverse Voices in Docs programs for people of color. We have a very elaborate intern program. And so it's a combination of, production and working with people on their films, a little bit with like the model of Hoop Dreams, but also this programmatic stuff that we do. And we have a board, we've become a true media arts organization.
Okay, then Gordon, I'm a filmmaker who has a film that I believe is part of that I believe would be appropriate as part of the Kartemquin team. How do I approach you guys with my film if this is the case? And how do you guys accept submissions?
Right. It's a process. We call it a courtship, for lack of a better analogy.
It's perfect. I love it.
And we want to make sure that it's the right fit, that these people actually really want to work with us and don't necessarily just want our name or think that we'll be helpful in raising money.
Of course.
And so, a good example is the film The Homestretch, about homeless high school youth here in Chicago, that was done by two women out of New York. And so we're like, well, I don't know. We had over about a 6 or 7 month period, we had a whole bunch of meetings with them, to make sure that they really did want to work with us, and that they really did want to work with us on the creative level. And it was a terrific project. They actually had Leslie Simmer, the one editor that we have on staff here, became their editor.
Oh, great.
And it was a real collaboration in terms of creatively making that film. And so that's what we're looking for. What we have right now is we've kind of formalized the process. And so we have what we call the pipeline committee. And there's a group of us, a filmmaker will have a preliminary conversation with me or usually with Tim Horsberg. And then we will bring it up to that committee and see if we want to, enter into more deeper conversations with those filmmakers about how we might work together. And if there's the potential to raise the money for it, because sometimes films that we've been involved in, we really want to help the filmmaker and see them get it finished, but they are never able to raise enough money for it to actually become a full-on Kartemquin co-production. But we stay involved to help them get it done and help them get it released. And stay involved creatively, but just not at the same level that we do in a full-blown co-production.
It's his favorite cake. He's a great kid. And some kids don't even live to get this age, That's another thing to be proud about. That, this is his 18th birthday, he lived, and to get to see 18, that's good.
I want to tell you that I love you very much. I'm very proud of you. It seemed like I was 18 just yesterday. Here, happy birthday. I love you.
Hey, hey. Happy birthday. I love you too, sweet.
Come on, here. Let's go. Happy birthday. Happy birthday, dear.
Happy birthday to you.
We don't have that much time left,
Sure.
but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the documentary filmmakers' statement of best practice in fair use,
fair use,
which you were a critical part of. When did this happen, Gordon, and how and why did this all come to be?
I think it was at the end of the 90s when I was approached by an old friend of mine, Pat Afterheide, who is now running the Center for Social Media and
Center for Media and Social Impact?
Yeah.
Okay.
At American University.
Yes.
It's now run by Katie Chateau-Boran, who is she's actually on our board. And Pat was on our first board. So we have a long history with the center. But Pat had been looking at our field along with Peter Yazzie, a leading intellectual property lawyer, with a worldwide reputation.
Okay.
And they had seen this problem, which is that in the U.S., we have a pretty good fair use clause in the copyright law. It says that you can use somebody else's copyrighted work in your work without licensing it from them if you're parodying it, critiquing it, to further an argument, to put something in historical context, or maybe if you've captured something inadvertently. But we lost the right to use this. With Hoop Dreams, there's a scene in Hoop Dreams where the family sings Arthur happy birthday.
Yeah.
And we had to license that for $5,000.
I forgot about that. That's right.
Yeah. And, the standard in the industry and what people were being taught in film school and what any lawyer you talk to would tell you, and the broadcasters and, the theatrical distributors, everyone had the same line. If you're a professional, if this is a real documentary, everything in it has to be cleared.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so this was a tremendous burden on the documentary community.
Yeah.
And some films weren't getting made. Other films weren't being able to talk about things in the way they wanted to talk about it because they couldn't afford the images.
Right.
And what Pat and Peter did was they did some big studies and they looked at our field and they saw the negative impact that this was happening. And they said, what Pat said to me was that you guys have got this terrible problem. And I was like, yeah, I know.
Yes, we do.
And she said, well, we have a solution. And you don't need to get a new law. The law is fine. You don't need to go to Congress and you don't need to go to the courts. The actual few court cases that exist in this area support a fairly robust fair use. Mm-hmm. And the thing about fair use is it's a balance of rights. It's a balance of rights between the maker and the need of everyone to be able to participate in the culture of their community.
The discourse, right.
The needs of a democratic society to be open and to be able to, use culture in that way and build on culture. And so we had meetings all across the country. We hosted 2 of them here at Chicago, where they would come in and talk to filmmakers, and we would hammer out, because we're rights holders too. We're on both sides of this issue. And we would hammer out kind of what we saw based within the parameters of what the law actually said, how we saw fair use. And we published the statement, the filmmaker statement of best practice. And then we spent the next 5 years trying to re-educate everyone. I never talked to so many lawyers here.
Oh, wow.
We went to conferences, we went to law firms and did their CLE luncheons, their internal education things. We were at film schools. We were re-educating everybody as to what the law actually said. And now we had this from our field as a whole. We stood up as a community and said, this is best practice on fair use,
Right.
and all this misconception that was out there. Like, you'd look in the standards and practices book at this period at like NBC, and it would say, you can use 30 seconds, but no more. Well, that's not what the law says.
Yeah, right.
The law says you can use as much as you need to make your point, no more. 10 seconds might be too much. 2 minutes might not be enough. It all depends on the context. And so we published this thing and we did all this re-education, and little by little, we just won an enormous victory. We changed the reality for what filmmakers could do and what would be accepted. PBS was the first to start broadcasting our fair use claims without being cleared, even though we didn't have E&O insurance on it. But eventually other broadcasters picked it up. We were getting into theaters with it. And the big breakthrough was when finally the insurance company said, yes, we will insure your fair use claims with E&O insurance.
Before we go, I would like to hear what's next for you and what's next for Kartemquin.
Well, I'll be working a lot with my new film that I did with Rachel Dixon and Tracy Matthews called 63 Boycott. It's about this great civil rights demonstration in 1963 where 250,000 kids, mostly African American, walked out of the schools to protest their putting trailers behind the black schools so that they wouldn't have to move those kids into the underutilized adjacent white schools. And it's going to premiere at the Chicago Film Festival on October 22nd, which is the actual anniversary of the boycott. And then it'll be at other festivals. There's another film, Keep Talking, Karen Weinberg's film, which is getting its international premiere, I think, at the Vancouver Film Festival, and is going to be at various film festivals. It's a film about indigenous Alaska people trying to preserve their language in a situation where there's only about 50 native speakers left.
Right. I was reading about that actually recently.
Yeah, a really good film. So we have quite a few. Unbroken Glass sort of had its festival run, and its theatrical, a mini theatrical run, which is a film about mental illness in an immigrant family. We've got a lot of new projects, some in the works, and many of it. You go through these ups and downs. We've had a period where a lot of things are getting finished within the last year. And then you'll go through a period where, you're just working on stuff and fewer films are being released.
Gordon Quinn, it has been an absolute pleasure. I cannot thank you enough for the incredible 50 years plus of documentary film work that you have done, what Kartemquin Films has done for doc filmmakers, for the fair use documentation, for having this conversation with us. I will thank Corey Koken again for putting us together or introducing us. And if you would be interested, I would love to have you on the show again sometime. There is so much more that we could cover, and you are a wealth of valuable insight and information for any documentary filmmaker. It's been an absolute honor. Thank you, Gordon.
Well, thanks. Glad to do it.
Don't forget, we'd love to have you join us in the Documentary Academy. Come and take a look at how we can help you make your best documentary film at thedocumentarylife.com/academy. That's thedocumentarylife.com/academy. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again for listening to the show, and remember to like and subscribe to this channel. Also, remember, for any of the URLs that may or may not be outdated and you want to get the most up-to-date information, perhaps for the documentary filmmaking courses, for the blog, for other episodes, just go ahead and check in the show notes below on this YouTube page, and that'll give you the correct URLs to use. Thanks again. Have a great day.